In a small village in Yemen, a girl named Salma Nasser was born into a world where other people made big decisions for her. She didn't get to choose her own path. She didn't get to say what she wanted. Before she was old enough to understand, her life was already planned. She lost her life while trying to bring another into the world. Her body was too young and too weak for such a heavy burden. The baby did not survive, and neither did she. Her death was not just a sad story. It was a sign of a much bigger problem, a system that failed her. This documentary tells Salma's story, from the beginning to the end. We show what her life was like, the choices made for her, and what happened after she died. Each part is based on real news reports, real interviews, and true events. We also use simple storytelling to help people understand what went wrong and why it still matters today. You will learn about her family, who believed marrying her off was the right thing to do. This story is not told with painful pictures or dramatic effects. We keep it honest and respectful, because the truth is powerful on its own. If you care about justice, if you believe that every girl deserves a voice, please like this video, subscribe, and share Salma's story. What happened to her should never happen again. In the dry, sun-scorched plains of rural Hodeidah province, Yemen, life was defined by simplicity and survival. For 12-year-old Salma Nasser, childhood was never about toys or school books. It was a daily rhythm of chores, silence, and unquestioned obedience. Her family lived in a one-room mud-brick home with a corrugated metal roof, shared by 7 people. They had no electricity, no running water, and no connection to the wider world beyond their village. They relied on lanterns for light and neighbors for news. Salma was born into poverty, the second daughter of Nasser al-Din and Fatima Nasser. Her father was a day laborer, taking odd jobs at farms when there was work. Her mother, like most women in their village, had never been to school. She worked endlessly at home, drawing water from distant wells, baking flatbread over open flames, and managing the house. Salma watched her mother with quiet admiration, but also an unspoken fear that this, too, would be her future. In the evenings, her mother would sometimes hum lullabies that spoke of patience, duty, and the silent strength of women. In Salma's world, girls were raised to obey, not to dream. From the age of 6, she began carrying water in small plastic jugs. By 8, she was grinding grain and cooking rice over firewood. Her hands became rough long before her mind could make sense of what was being denied to her. She wanted to learn, to read like the boys at the mosque school, but there was no money and no point, according to her father. Her older brother, Ibrahim, attended school while she stayed behind. It wasn't seen as unfair. It was simply the way things had always been. Tradition governed every aspect of her life. Girls were considered a burden unless they were married off early, thus freeing the family of financial responsibility. In their village, a girl's value was tied to how soon she could be given away. Talking back was considered disrespectful. Asking questions was shameful. And Salma, like many girls before her, internalized these rules with a quiet, painful acceptance. Her future was mapped out by others, and she walked that path with small, obedient steps. Though she had moments of childish joy, playing with her cousins, braiding her sister's hair, or listening to stories from her grandmother, they were fleeting. Her body was still growing, her bones thin and delicate. But to the community, she was nearing readiness for marriage. Her period had not yet come, but proposals had already been whispered about. Women would glance at her during weddings and comment on how mature she looked for her age. It made her uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to express that. The older women in the village would sometimes speak in hushed tones about their own childhoods, about pain and fear on wedding nights, about their first pregnancies before they understood what motherhood meant. But such stories were quickly silenced, buried under proverbs and prayers. Salma overheard these things and felt a knot of dread in her stomach, yet she kept smiling. Salma Nasser was just 10 years old when the decision was made. It wasn't a decision she took part in. In her village, a girl's future was often planned long before she understood what it meant to have one. Her father, Nasser al-Din, agreed to a marriage arrangement with Marwan al-Hakim, a 24-year-old man from a neighboring town. Marwan was considered a good match. He came from a respected family, had some income from farming, and more importantly, he agreed to pay a modest bride price. For families like Salma's, marriage wasn't just a personal decision. It was an economic arrangement, a cultural obligation, and a social expectation. Salma's mother, Fatima, did not resist. She had once been in that situation herself. This was the norm. Girls were raised to accept, not question. At the heart of this practice was a complex web of beliefs. Early marriage was viewed as a way to protect a girl's honor, secure her future, and ease the financial burden on families. Clerics often cited religion as justification. In many sermons, it was preached that early marriage kept girls away from temptation and preserved family dignity. For rural parents with limited resources and no access to formal education, these messages carried weight. There was no formal consent. Salma was not asked what she wanted. At that age, she still played with her younger cousins. She did not understand what it meant to be a wife. But she was told to prepare. Preparations began quickly. A simple dress was sewn, gifts were exchanged between families, and neighbors congratulated Nasser for marrying off his daughter early, as if this was a milestone to be celebrated. Salma stood silently during most of the conversations, her face blank, her questions unanswered. The ceremony proceeded with prayer and feasting. Salma followed cues, standing when told, sitting when instructed, smiling when nudged. When the crowd erupted in cheer, as she was officially declared a wife, Salma did not fully understand what had just happened. She only knew that something in her life had shifted, irreversibly. Later that night, long after the guests had left and the laughter had faded, Salma sat in a room that was no longer her own. The bangles on her wrist clinked gently as she stared at the floor, the wedding dress now folded beside her. In that moment, the celebration was over. What remained was someone too young for the words spoken in her name, too small for the dress she wore, and too unprepared for the world that now called her a wife. When Salma Nasser entered Marwan al-Hakim's home, she was only 11 years old. The ceremony had been celebrated with food, music, and local tradition, but what came after was not a continuation of joy. It was a shift into an unfamiliar world where expectations collided with the limitations of a child's mind and body. The house she moved into was modest: 2 rooms, a clay kitchen, and a shared courtyard. Marwan, her 24-year-old husband, worked as a local vendor. He believed he had fulfilled a cultural duty by taking a young bride, as was practiced by generations before him. For Marwan, marriage meant obedience and quiet companionship. But Salma, confused and detached, saw no meaning in her new role. She had no peers to talk to. The women in the neighborhood treated her as a wife, not as a girl. They taught her how to grind spices, wash clothes, and carry herself with modesty, but they never asked how she felt. There were no school books, no playmates, no time to rest. The dolls she had once played with were left behind in her father's home. Her identity, once built around laughter and curiosity, now revolved around housework and silence. Salma rarely spoke. She often sat in the corner of the room, folding and unfolding her scarf, watching the sunlight pass through the window slats. Marwan, after long days at work, expected meals and silence. If she wept at night, no one asked why. Her tears dried on her cheeks, leaving behind traces of longing she could not name. Physical changes began to worry her. Her small frame struggled with the demands placed on her. Her appetite waned. Headaches and abdominal pain became frequent, but complaints were seen as disobedience. Even when she was ill, she was reminded that she had duties. "Girls mature faster," her mother-in-law once said. "You are lucky to have a home of your own." On Fridays, neighbors gathered for tea, often exchanging stories of their daughters and wives. Salma was not included in these talks. She was spoken about, not spoken to. Occasionally, older women offered unsolicited advice about pleasing her husband and being patient. These conversations confused her more than they helped. She felt small in a world that demanded her to be grown. The emotional strain was no less severe. The absence of nurturing voices, the pressure to meet marital expectations, and the silence surrounding her suffering all contributed to her growing withdrawal. By the time Salma Nasser turned 12, something irreversible had already changed in her life. Just months into her arranged marriage with Marwan al-Hakim, the news arrived that she was pregnant. Her body, still small, was carrying the weight of something it was never prepared for. But for her family, this was not seen as a crisis. It was a cause for celebration. The moment Salma's mother, Fatima, noticed the signs, she alerted the family matriarchs. Whispers turned into warm congratulations. In the Nasser household, her pregnancy was viewed as a fulfillment of her duty. Her father, Nasser al-Din, beamed with pride. To him and many others in the community, this was confirmation that the marriage was not only valid but fruitful. It meant Salma was a real wife now, a woman in their eyes. Women from the village came bearing small gifts, dates, incense, and advice. Elderly women sat with Salma, recounting their own experiences as child brides, offering her warm smiles and herbal remedies. No one asked her if she was scared. No one questioned her silence. Instead, they told her to be proud. Behind closed doors, however, Salma's body was breaking. She often felt dizzy, nauseated, and exhausted. The nausea came in waves that left her curled in bed for hours. She had trouble walking for long periods. Her appetite was erratic, and her limbs ached constantly. But she said nothing. In a culture where obedience was expected and endurance was praised, her suffering was normalized. Marwan, her husband, remained distant. He saw the pregnancy as a badge of masculinity, proof of his virility. He did not accompany her to any medical checkups, and there were no formal appointments made. The nearest clinic was far, and no one saw the need to go unless things got worse. In her heart, Salma did not know whether to be happy or afraid. She held her belly at night, confused about what was growing inside her. The only time she had seen a baby born was during a neighbor's delivery, one that had involved screams, blood, and panic. But even that did not prepare her. Salma often complained of back pain, nausea beyond the ordinary, and constant fatigue. But in her village, pain was something to be endured, not examined. Her mother, Fatima, reassured her with whispered sayings. "All women go through it," she'd say, avoiding Salma's eyes. No one thought to question if a child should be enduring what grown women barely survived. Medical care was limited to a small clinic several kilometers away, and visits were rare. Salma's husband, Marwan, believed that seeking help was unnecessary unless there was an emergency. To him, Salma's suffering was part of the process, a test of endurance and proof of womanhood. Meanwhile, the community treated her symptoms as normal. There was no midwife monitoring her progress, no prenatal care. Her nutrition remained poor, mostly bread and tea. Her small frame bore the growing burden of a pregnancy with no support. One neighbor recalled later that Salma had once fainted while fetching water, but it was blamed on the heat. She was just tired, they said. No one looked deeper. Behind closed doors, Salma grew more withdrawn. The pain made her quiet, and the lack of understanding made her invisible. As her due date approached, the signs of distress were all there, but went unnoticed. Her eyes lost their spark. Her skin grew pale. She winced when she walked. She was a girl unraveling in silence. And still, no one saw a reason to be alarmed. No one thought a hospital visit was urgent. At just 12 years old, her labor began, far too young for the weight of motherhood. It started with cramps, sharp, rhythmic, and unrelenting. At first, her mother, Fatima, believed it was normal that the baby would come soon. After all, births happened at home all the time in their part of rural Hodeidah. They were poor, but they had seen other girls deliver at home. None of them had seemed this pained, but they told themselves every woman was different. If you've made it this far, it means you care. And stories like Salma's need people who care. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Every share, every comment, every voice helps bring more attention to the issues that matter. They laid her on a straw mattress in the corner of the mud-walled room. Family members gathered outside, some whispering prayers, others debating whether to send for a midwife from the next village. But Marwan, her 24-year-old husband, insisted this was nothing out of the ordinary. He had seen his sisters go through childbirth. He reminded everyone that too much interference only made things worse. So they waited. By the end of the first day, Salma's cries had grown louder, more desperate. Her body convulsed at times. Fatima tried everything she knew, herbal infusions passed down through generations, warm compresses on her daughter's back, and whispered supplications. But Salma's body wasn't ready. Her frame was small, her pelvis undeveloped. She had barely entered puberty. On the second day, her screams started fading. Her lips were dry, her face looked sunken. Her breathing grew irregular. Fatima knelt beside her daughter, tears falling silently. She begged her husband, Nasser al-Din, to take Salma to a hospital, but he was conflicted. Taking her to a hospital meant exposing their secret, a marriage many already whispered about. What if they were accused of wrongdoing? Neighbors had heard Salma's cries. One elderly woman came by and quietly offered to help arrange transport, but the father waved her off. Pride, shame, and denial wrapped tightly around the family like a rope. They chose silence. The third day arrived, and Salma no longer had the strength to cry. She lay soaked in sweat, her breathing shallow. Blood began seeping through the bedding. Fatima screamed then. This was no longer childbirth. It was something else, something dangerous, something final. Only then did the family act. A cousin brought a truck. They wrapped Salma in a sheet and rushed her to the Al-Zahra district hospital. She arrived limp, eyes barely open. The nurses rushed her to a room. Doctors quickly followed. What they saw horrified them. Salma's condition was critical by the time she reached the hospital. Her body was weak, and the labor had taken a heavy toll. Doctors tried everything they could: emergency care, medication, and support. But her small body could no longer keep up. Doctors managed to extract the baby, but it was lifeless. A stillbirth. A boy who never had a name. Moments later, Salma's heartbeat faltered. Despite all efforts, Salma passed away a few hours later. Outside, her family waited without asking questions. Her husband, Marwan al-Hakim, stood silently with arms folded, his face unreadable. He never looked at the gurney as they wheeled her body out. There were no outbursts, no tears, just the hollow sound of shoes on the tiled floor. The hospital's report listed the cause of death as postpartum hemorrhage due to obstructed labor. But the real cause, early marriage and negligence, was never entered into any official file. The institution moved on. Staff returned to routine. But for that one day, Al-Zahra District Hospital bore silent witness to a life that never had a chance to begin, and a tragedy that could have been prevented. Salma Nasser was buried quietly. No public funeral, no acknowledgement of what her death meant. But for those who saw her in that hospital room, the memory never left. They had seen the cost of silence, the weight of cultural complacency, and they would carry it with them for years to come. Later that week, even though hospital staff were advised not to speak to the media, a young nurse named Hanan reached out to a local reporter from the Hodeidah Daily. She didn't share her full name, but she felt it was important that the truth was known. Hanan described what she had witnessed and the events leading up to that night. The story was published with the headline, "Young Girl Passes Away During Delivery." It quickly spread across Yemen, drawing attention from national outlets, and soon, international news organizations began to take notice as well. Hanan described the panic in the emergency room, the girl's body, the helplessness of the staff. She expressed her sorrow and frustration, not only as a healthcare worker, but as a Yemeni woman. She said, "We see this too often. But this time, I couldn't stay quiet. She was still a child. She should have been playing in school, not dying on an operating table." Her words struck a chord. Across Yemen, whispers turned into conversations. In cities like Sana'a and Taiz, women's groups began referencing the anonymous nurse's account. International organizations cited the article in press releases. The story had pierced through cultural denial. Though she never revealed her identity publicly, Hanan's account became one of the earliest first-hand testimonies tied to Salma's death. It helped transform a private tragedy into a national controversy. That moment, one nurse choosing to speak out, began a ripple that reached far beyond the walls of Al-Zahra Hospital. The tone of these articles was somber but direct. They did not sensationalize. They simply laid bare a painful reality. That girls like Salma were being married off too early, expected to bear children before their bodies were ready, and dying in silence. Within Yemen, the response was mixed, but increasingly loud. While some conservative voices defended the practice on religious or traditional grounds, many Yemenis, especially women, voiced their anger. Civil society groups organized small but vocal protests in Sana'a and Taiz. Activists like Amal Basha, a longtime advocate for women's rights in Yemen, used Salma's case to renew calls for setting a legal minimum age for marriage. "This is not about culture," she said during an interview. "This is about survival." The case also drew the attention of Reem Al Numery, a teenage activist who had herself escaped a forced marriage. Reem used her growing platform to highlight the systemic abuse that made tragedies like Salma's possible. "It's not just one girl, it's a pattern," she told reporters. International human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, issued statements condemning child marriage in Yemen. They urged the government to take immediate action, both to protect young girls and to hold accountable those who enabled such unions. The United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, also weighed in, pointing out the direct link between early marriage, maternal mortality, and the lack of reproductive health care. Their brief on Salma's case was circulated among policymakers, helping turn one girl's tragic death into a broader push for reform. For the first time in years, the issue of child marriage in Yemen was at the forefront of global discourse. Salma's story had broken through the noise, not as a symbol, but as a child whose life could have been saved. For a brief moment, the tide appeared to turn. Within Yemen's lower house of parliament, a proposal was tabled to establish 17 as the minimum legal age for marriage. The legislation gained initial traction. Some politicians cited the moral and medical imperative, while others noted mounting international embarrassment. Civil society groups, including human rights lawyers and women's organizations, submitted memos, held protests, and petitioned lawmakers. The proposed law was, in many ways, a response to Salma's case, a symbol of the nation's crossroads between tradition and reform. But almost as soon as it gained momentum, resistance began to build. Conservative factions, particularly religious clerics and traditionalist blocs in parliament, argued that setting a minimum age for marriage contradicted Islamic teachings and cultural values. They invoked religious texts and interpretations to justify early marriages, claiming parents had the right to marry off their children as they saw fit. Clerics held their own gatherings and counter-rallies, warning that the West was attempting to impose foreign moral standards on Yemen. The issue was reframed by opponents as not one of child protection, but of sovereignty and faith. Media outlets aligned with conservative interests began running editorials accusing reformists of betraying Yemen's heritage. Some lawmakers who initially supported the bill began to waver, facing pressure from their constituents and party leaders. The atmosphere within Parliament grew tense and polarized. Debate stalled, meetings were delayed. Eventually, despite the initial approval in the lower house, the bill languished in the upper chamber. It was never signed into law. The promise of reform faded under the weight of political calculation and ideological resistance. For activists, this failure was devastating. Salma's story had become a rallying cry, but even her death was not enough to secure the basic protection of a legal minimum age for marriage. The stalled bill became symbolic of Yemen's fractured approach to reform. Progressive voices growing louder, but unable to break through deeply entrenched norms and political inertia. Though the law did not pass, the conversation had begun, and for many, that was the first step. Years had passed since the tragedy that took Salma Nasser's life. The dust that once swirled in the narrow lanes of her village had long settled. But for her mother, Fatima, time did not heal. It only deepened the silence. In the beginning, Fatima said little. The village whispered. Journalists came and went, and human rights workers scribbled in notepads. Still, Fatima remained mostly quiet. She stayed behind the clay walls of their small home, retreating into her daily chores. The pain wasn't just personal, it was also communal. Admitting sorrow was seen as betrayal. Questioning the past was considered defiance. But when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of buried grief. In a televised interview years later, Fatima sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes lowered. She didn't cry. Her voice was even, practiced. She said, "I thought I was doing what was right. I was told it would bring honor. I was told she would be safe." There was no anger in her tone, only fatigue. "She was my daughter. I didn't know how to say no. My husband decided, the village elders approved. I just followed." Fatima explained how poverty had shaped their choices. The family had struggled for years. Feeding Salma and her siblings meant hard decisions. When Marwan al-Hakim came with a proposal, it seemed like a blessing. He came from a family with means. He offered security, or what passed for it. Looking back, Fatima did not absolve herself. "I wish I had known better," she said softly, "but no one around me ever questioned it. Girls marry young, that's how it has always been." Her words reflected more than personal loss. They echoed a broader national dilemma: how deeply rooted customs can override concern, how culture and survival often silence conscience. Across Yemen, her voice struck a nerve. Some criticized her for complicity, others wept with her. NGOs used her testimony as a teaching tool, a sobering reminder that behind every child marriage is a web of normalized injustice, one that often implicates the very people who love the child the most. Fatima's reflection marked a turning point. Not in law, Yemen's minimum marriage age bill remained stalled, but in conversation. For Marwan, Salma's husband, after the tragedy, he returned to his community with few questions asked. There was no police investigation, no arrest, and no public shaming. In fact, in the eyes of many in the village, he had done nothing wrong. His marriage was considered legitimate, approved by families and religious customs. He resumed his life quietly. A few months after Salma's death, Marwan remarried. His new bride was also young, but older than Salma had been. Villagers saw it as a natural step forward. While there were murmurs of discomfort from a few neighbors, the overall community sentiment remained unchanged. In their worldview, Marwan had fulfilled his role as a husband. What happened to Salma was seen as a tragedy of fate, not a consequence of choice. Marwan rarely spoke about Salma. When asked, he would respond with a mix of indifference and resignation. To him, it was a painful event, but not something he viewed as his fault. There was no legal framework to hold him accountable, and no authority stepped in to examine his actions. In the years following Salma Nasser's death, hope flickered across Yemen's dusty rural landscapes. Her story had reached headlines far beyond her village, prompting conversations in Sana'a, New York, Geneva, and beyond. For a moment, it seemed her suffering might shift the tide. But in the villages where donkeys outnumber school teachers, change came slowly, if at all. This kind of marriage continues in many places, often hidden, often accepted, and far too often ignored. Salma's voice was never heard while she was alive. But through this story, we hope her experience can speak for others who are still waiting to be protected. Change begins with awareness, with education, with the courage to challenge harmful traditions, and the compassion to protect those who cannot yet protect themselves. If this story moved you, please don't let it end here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, share Salma's story with someone else. Use your voice to stand up for girls who still don't have one.